Somewhere out there is a version of you that exists only in someone else's head. And the worst part? You don't get a vote on who that version is.
You're listening to Unbound, off script. No outlines, no safety nets, just Beth Curry talking about whatever the hell she wants, or whatever the hell you've asked her to uncover. It's unfiltered, it's unpredictable, and it's officially started. Pull up a chair and don't expect her to stop talking anytime soon. She's a total blabbermouth. Take it away, Beth.
Hi, everybody. You're listening to Unbound. This is an off-script episode. I'm Beth. So today I want to start with a question, and I want you to really think about it. Like, if you have to pause the show for a second just to think about the answer to this, I want you to. I don't want you to just kind of skim past it like you might with everything else today, okay? How many people out there have a completely wrong story about you running in their head right now? And you have no idea that it's even happening. That number is never zero, okay? For anyone, it can't be, because the uncomfortable math of being a human who exists around every other human on the planet, every relationship you've ever had ends one of two ways. So it either gets resolved, like actually talked through and sat in and understood, or it gets interpreted. And when something doesn't get resolved, the human brain does not leave it alone at all. It doesn't sit there as a blank space, right? It gets filled in, and it gets filled in with guesses, with old wounds, maybe with whatever story is easiest to believe at 2 a.m, right? So today's episode is about that filling in process. It's about misunderstandings that never got the chance to unmisunderstand themselves, right? It's about what happens when 2 or 3 or more people walk away from the same relationship holding 3 different versions of what actually happened. And none of them are lies exactly. They're just incomplete. And it's about the thing nobody wants to talk about at all, which is that not getting closure isn't just sad, okay? It's not just an inconvenience. It is medically and psychologically bad for you, for everyone involved, including, weirdly, the person doing all the judging. And also, an important message at the end to kind of tie it all together. So, going to get into it. There's a concept in psychology called the Zeigarnik effect, and it's named after a Soviet psychologist, Bluma Zeigarnik, who in the 1920s noticed something strange while sitting in a cafe in Vienna. Okay, the waiters could perfectly recall complicated and unpaid orders, but the second the bill was settled, the memory kind of vanished, right? Unfinished tasks stick, and finished ones do not. So Zeigarnik took it into the lab and confirmed it. People remember interrupted tasks far better than completed ones. Your brain treats an open loop kind of like an open tap, right? It just kind of keeps running in the background, just quietly chewing up memory and energy until it's finally closed. So if we apply that to relationships, like say a friendship that ends with a clean mutual conversation, even a hard one, it just kind of gets filed away. It's this finished task, right? The brain can close the tab, but a friendship or a relationship that ends in confusion or in half-said things or in one person ghosting the other, leaving the other one left behind holding 100,000 unanswered questions, that's an open loop that the brain can't stop running. And because your brain hates uncertainty even more than it hates bad news, believe it or not, it will manufacture an ending for you, whether you ask it to or not. And this is where things get really messy, because the ending that your brain manufactures is almost never neutral. Okay, it's shaped by something called the fundamental attribution error. And that's our default tendency to explain other people's behavior using their character while explaining our own behavior using our circumstances. Like if I snapped at you, it's because I was exhausted and stressed. But if you strapped at me, it's because you're a cruel asshole, right? Same behavior, but two completely different verdicts, really. And the only variable is whose head the story is happening in, right? So when a relationship ends without resolution and someone's left to fill in the blanks on their own, they're not filling them in with neutral information at all. They're filling them in with the worst simplest, most character-based explanation available because that's what an anxious, pattern-hungry brain reaches for first. And once that explanation takes hold, something even more stubborn kicks in. Now, I think it's worth pausing here to say this isn't something that is wrong with or unique to petty or insecure people, okay? This is just what brains do, including good, thoughtful, well-meaning brains, okay? The mistake isn't that someone filled in a gap. The mistake is mistaking the filled-in version for the actual full truth and then acting or gossiping or deciding as though it were verified fact rather than what it actually is, which is just a guess being fancy in the confidence of certainty because uncertainty was too uncomfortable to sit with, right? Now, another one, confirmation bias kind of gets thrown around a lot, especially, well, usually about politics. But it is brutally relevant in personal relationships too. Once someone has landed on a narrative, she's manipulative, he's selfish, they were never really my friend, whatever, their brain starts doing something automatic and largely unconscious. Okay, it starts collecting evidence for that story and discarding or reinterpreting even anything that contradicts it. Okay, it's not even malicious. Most of the time anyway. It's a neurological efficiency, right? The brain wants coherence more than it wants accuracy. So a confusing, contradictory person, someone who was kind sometimes and distant other times, maybe generous in one season and absent in another, is cognitively expensive to hold in your head, right? A simple villain is cheap. So once a person finds a version of events that resolves the confusion, even if it's wrong, the brain clings to it the way you would cling to a life raft, not because it's the most accurate raft. That doesn't even make sense. Because it is a raft, okay? And here's a little something that should make you wince a little. Other people get recruited onto that raft. Because telling the story out loud to other friends, to family, to anyone who will listen, does two things at once. It reinforces the narrator's own belief through something psychologists call the self-persuasion effect. We come to believe our own arguments more strongly the more often we repeat them, regardless of whether new evidence ever showed up. And also, it spreads the unfinished, unverified version of events to people who never had access to the original relationship at all, or they did because they were one of the background players, if you will. They're now holding an opinion about someone they may have never even met, built entirely on someone else's interrupted story. In fact, in some cases, that's how this begins. Gossip, someone you think is a friend talks shit about you to another one of their friends, and then maybe that friend starts to treat you in a way you don't deserve because it all began on gossip. Anyway, that's how reputations quietly erode, okay? It's not necessarily through like one big friggin' lie or anything. It's through like 100 small retellings of an incomplete narrative, each one a little more certain than the last because repetition feels a hell of a lot like proof, even when it isn't. So here's where I want to slow down a little bit because this is the part that people skip past all the time. We talk about misunderstandings and grudges like they're purely emotional weather, right? Annoying, uncomfortable, but ultimately harmless. They're not, okay? There is a real physiological cost, and it lands on both people, the one being misjudged and, this is the part that surprises people, the one doing all the judging as well. Chronic rumination, which is the technical term for replaying a conflict or a grievance over and over and over and over without resolution, has been linked in research to sustained elevation of cortisol, and that's the body's primary stress hormone, right? Cortisol is useful in short bursts. It's what gets you out of the way of a car. It's not built to run continuously for months on end, right? Long-term elevation has been associated with disrupted sleep, suppressed immune function, increased inflammation, a higher risk of anxiety and depressive systems. Goes on and on, okay? The person who's like pissed off and angry, who is retelling the story to anybody who will listen, who's mentally rehearsing the wrong that was done to them, they are not winning. Their nervous system is in a low-grade fight response that doesn't get to switch off, right? Because the threat, in this case, a relationship that ended badly, never gets resolved enough for the body to stand down, right? And the person on the other end, the one being talked about, the one who knows there's a false story circulating but has no way to correct it, experiences something psychologically distinct but equally costly. There is a body of research on what's sometimes called moral injury and social rejection that shows the brain processes social pain or the pain of being excluded, misjudged, defamed, whatever, in overlapping regions to physical pain. So the anterior cingulate cortex, the area that lights up when you stub your toe, right, also lights up when you're left out of something or falsely accused of something. It's not a metaphor when people say it hurts. It registers neurologically as injury, right? So you have two people. One is stuck in a cortisol loop fueled by a story they've convinced themselves is true, and the other is carrying something closer to an open wound with no clear way to close it because the other person isn't speaking to them or doesn't believe there's anything left to discuss. So neither of these is a healthy, steady state, right? Both of them are quietly expensive every damn day, whether either person is consciously thinking about it or not. There's also a polyvagal piece worth mentioning because it kind of explains something a lot of people experience but don't have the words for. They don't know how to explain it, right? So polyvagal theory describes how the nervous system shifts between states depending on perceived safety. A calm, socially engaged state when things feel secure and a more defensive, vigilant state when they don't, right? Ongoing conflict, especially the unresolved kind, tends to keep the nervous system tipped towards that defensive state far longer than the actual triggering event lasted. And that's why someone can feel a flare of anger or hurt months later over something that on paper should be old news, right? The nervous system isn't being dramatic. It's responding exactly the way it's built to respond to an unresolved threat, and an unresolved relationship to the body can register as exactly that, right? So this is the part I really want to stick. There is no version of this where someone wins, okay, by staying unresolved and certain. The certainty might feel like some sort of strength. It is biologically closer to a wound that never got to scab over. Now, there's a strange irony in all of this, too. The moment someone most needs grace, when they're confused or hurt or defensive, maybe even a little bit wrong, is exactly the moment grace becomes the hardest to access. So, forgiveness researcher Everett Worthington, who spent decades studying this clinically, developed something called the REACH model. Recall the hurt, empathize with the offender, give an altruistic gift of forgiveness, commit to it, and hold on to it when doubt creeps back in. What's notable about his research is that forgiveness, when it actually happens, isn't shown to primarily benefit the person being forgiven. Okay, it shows up most reliably as a benefit to the person doing the forgiving. Lower blood pressure, reduced depressive symptoms, better sleep, and in studies that have tracked this over time, all of these things have been shown. And I'm someone who fully believes and preaches that forgiveness is for you. 100% it's for you. And it's for you to break the chain. I talked about this extensively in season 3 when people couldn't understand how I could forgive someone who raped me and killed my baby. I was attached to him by this invisible chain that I created. And when I decided to forgive him, I cut that chain and I released myself from this man after decades, right? Here's why soft hearts go missing exactly when they're needed, though. Hurt activates threat circuitry. And threat circuitry is not interested in nuance, okay? When you feel betrayed or misjudged, your nervous system doesn't gently suggest, maybe consider their perspective, right? It floods you with certainty and self-protection because evolutionary behavior and evolutionarily hesitation in the face of a threat was the dangerous option, right? The problem is that social betrayal isn't a saber-toothed tiger. It doesn't require a fight or flight response. It requires the much slower and much less satisfying work of holding, my least favorite word that I use a lot, complexity, right? The idea that someone can have hurt you and not be a monster. That a friendship can have been real and still have ended badly. That you can be angry and still be wrong about some of the details, right? That kind of dual holding is cognitively and emotionally expensive. It is much easier in the short term, as I said, to pick a villain. You're picking a bad guy. The tragedy is that picking a villain costs more in the long term than holding the complexity ever would have, right? Now, I would be lying if I pretended this was purely an internal psychological phenomenon and just kind of left it there, because the world we're actually doing this in now has a few extra accelerants built in, and it would be irresponsible if I left them out of this episode. A few decades ago, an unresolved falling out stayed relatively contained, right? You told a couple friends your side, they told a couple of theirs, and the story just kind of decayed naturally over time, the way most gossip does. It got boring and people moved on and the details got fuzzy, and eventually nobody could even remember what started it. Annoying, sure, but self-limiting, okay? That's not how it works anymore, sadly. Now there's a group chat. There's a screenshot possibly taken out of context, possibly from a moment when somebody was tired or hurt, or simply being a person instead of a saint, now preserved forever and forwardable to anybody with a thumb. There's the social pull of needing to pick a side because ambiguity is uncomfortable, and humans, as we've established, hate an open loop. So a friend group will often unconsciously rush towards resolution by collectively agreeing on a bad guy just to make the discomfort stop, right? Nobody sits down and votes on it. It just happens, kind of the way water finds the lowest point. There's also like a newer psychological wrinkle worth naming, in my opinion. It's research on what's sometimes called context collapse. It's a term that originally described how social media flattens different audiences into one feed. Applies just as well to social conflict. So a joke that made sense between two people who knew each other's history reads as cruelty to a stranger seeing it stripped of context, right? A vulnerable, messy text sent at 1 a.m. reads as unhinged when it's shown to someone who never knew the relationship that produced it. The information isn't fabricated. It's just kind of missing its frame. And missing the frame is sometimes more damaging than an outright lie because there's no obvious falsehood to correct. Just a true thing that's just been presented in a way that kind of guarantees the worst possible read, right? The fun fact version of this, if you want one for trivia night, psychologists have found that negative information is processed faster and weighted more heavily by the brain than positive or neutral information. This is a phenomenon that researchers call negativity bias. It's thought to be an evolutionary leftover, like missing a threat that was historically far more costly than missing a reward. So the brain became exquisitely good at clocking danger and comparatively lazy about clocking nuance, right? So translate that into modern terms, a single rumor, screenshot, or a secondhand story will almost always outweigh years of lived, complicated, ordinary friendship in the court of group chat opinion, okay? It's not that people are cruel. Usually, people can be. I know some. I'm speaking of some. It's that their brains are wired to overweight the one alarming data point and underweight the boring and decent majority of the relationship that never made it into anyone's screenshots because nothing dramatic happens when two people are just quietly fine with each other, right? None of this is an argument for despair, okay? It's an argument for humility on every side. If you've ever been the one filling in someone else's silence with your worst guess, you were just doing exactly what every human brain is built to do under uncertainty, right? Doesn't make it accurate, it just makes it understandable, which is sometimes the first ingredient you need before you can let a grudge soften at all. I want to gently correct something a lot of us believe as well, and that's that closure requires the other person. That you need the conversation or the apology or the explanation before you're allowed to move on. Therapists who work in trauma and grief will tell you something different. Closure is not an event that happens to you from the outside. It's a process that happens inside you. And the maddening, freeing truth is that it can happen with or without the other person's participation. This matters enormously for situations where the conversation is never going to happen, okay? Where the person has decided you're not worth talking to, or you've decided the same about them, or too much time and too many other people have gotten involved for a clean conversation to even be possible anymore. None of that disqualifies you from closure. It just means that you have to build it a little bit differently. So I'm going to share a few things that actual research-backed practice points to, okay? Writing the letter you'll never send is not a cliche for nothing, okay? Expressive writing research, going back to psychologist James Pennebaker's work in the 1980s, consistently shows that putting a painful, unresolved experience into words, even privately, reduces physiological stress markers and improves long-term emotional processing. The mechanism doesn't require the other person to ever read it. The nervous system responds to the act of organizing the chaos into language. full stop. There's also radical acceptance, which I have talked a lot about because it's something I practice. A lot of people think I'm weird about it, but I do it and it's helpful. It's a concept from dialectical behavior therapy. It's the practice of fully acknowledging reality as it is, including the parts that are unfair or incomplete, without the acknowledgement meaning approval. Okay? You can radically accept that someone believes a false version of you and still know it's false and still grieve that you can't fix it all at the same time. Okay? When I tell you the bit at the end, you'll understand that this is what I have done and used and whatever in many, many situations. Anyway, fighting reality, like insisting that it shouldn't be this way, is what keeps the wound from closing, right? Accepting that it is this way, even though it's unjust, is what allows healing to start, because you stop spending energy resisting something you can't change and you start spending it on something that you can. And finally, this one's less clinical, but more just true. Releasing the need to be understood by someone who's already decided not to understand you is its own form of closure, okay? As my contributing writer to this episode today has often said, you can paint any picture of me that you want, but I will not be framing it. I think that's brilliant, you know? It's not because you stop caring. It's because you recognize that you can't reach into someone else's head and edit the story they have chosen to believe, right? You can only make sure you're not the author of a false story yourself. You can only make sure that if someone ever does come back with an open hand, you're not the one who slams the door, right? So I want to step out from behind the research for a minute, because everything I just walked you through isn't something I read about and found interesting. I already mentioned my co-writer on this episode and I lived a version of this together and also separately in our own ways at different points. We're not going to walk you through the dirty details because the details aren't actually the point. You already know, if you've made it this far, that the details are exactly the part that gets distorted and retold and weaponized the most, right? What I will tell you is this. There were bad actors involved in how things fell apart. Not people we've decided to villainize after the fact. Verifiably, actually bad actors, okay? People who took something messy and human and turned it into something engineered. And one of the uglier twists is that the narrative those bad actors built didn't just damage the original relationships. It got redirected, pointed back at us, the ones who'd actually been on the receiving end of it, so that we ended up cast as the problem in a story we didn't write and didn't agree to be characters in. So here's what's actually true about where we landed. We are at peace with each other and increasingly with what happened. You know, we don't sit around talking about the people involved. We have zero interest in bringing any of the people involved back into our space. You know, we don't bring them up at dinner. We don't follow the threads. We don't keep the score. If I'm honest, outside of building this very episode and maybe a couple others where, you know, we've had to discuss certain things, neither of us thinks about the other players in this much at all anymore, which is itself proof of something, because there was a stretch of time where we thought almost nothing else, right? And that piece didn't arrive because the story got corrected. It didn't. You know, we owned our parts, the things we got wrong, the ways we could have communicated better, the moments where we were also just two flawed people doing our best in a confusing situation. We tried to speak our truths plainly and directly to the people who needed to hear them. Those truths weren't accepted. They weren't heard. And at some point separately, we both arrived at the same conclusion without planning it. That stopped being our problem to solve. You know, we'd done the only honest part that was ever ours to do. And what happened to that truth after we offered it, whether it landed, whether it got believed, whether it got twisted into something else entirely and is still gossiped about to this day, was never actually within our control. And holding on to the outcome was the thing that kept us stuck, not the original hurt itself. So when I tell you that letting go while still holding your truth is possible, I'm not selling you a concept, okay? I'm telling you what it looks like from the other side of it. Physically lighter, emotionally quieter, and free of a story that used to run in the background of basically everything, okay? We didn't get the apology. We never will. We didn't get the correction. We got something better and stranger, which is that it simply stopped mattering whether we ever did, okay? So what do you actually do with all of this, especially if the person isn't coming back? So you know, I like to offer advice based on research and studying and experience. You can correct the record without correcting the person. You don't need their permission to live truthfully. to simply not perpetuate the same dynamic with anyone else, and to not be someone who fills silence with assumptions and gossip the way that, it was once done to you. You can hold the contradiction instead of resolving it falsely. You're allowed to say, even just to yourself, this person hurt me, and I probably also got some of it wrong. And both of those things are true at once, and I don't need a tidy villain to make peace with it. You can grieve the friendship as a real thing that happened instead of retroactively deciding it was fake because it ended badly. Things can be real and still end. That's not a contradiction. That's just most relationships eventually. And you can let your own behavior going forward be the apology you can't deliver directly. Becoming someone less reactive, less quick to fill silence with the worst case story, less willing to let an unfinished conversation calcify into a permanent verdict about another human being. Don't travel and live in gossip. All of these things. That's not nothing. That's the work. And it's the work that doesn't require the other person's participation at all. It doesn't require their forgiveness or even their awareness that you're doing it. And there's one more thing I think it's worth saying, because it's the part people kind of leave out when they talk about moving on. Making good on this doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt, and it doesn't mean performing forgiveness you haven't actually arrived at yet. Forced peace is just another kind of unfinished business, meant to look resolved. The actual work is slower. It's probably a lot less photogenic than that. It looks like noticing maybe 6 months later that you thought about it for a shorter stretch than usual. Maybe it looks like running into a mutual friend and not needing to relitigate the whole damn thing to feel okay, right? It looks like being able to hold a genuinely good memory from that friendship without it getting hijacked by how things ended. None of that requires the other person to ever know it happened. And that's, I guess, sort of the point, right? So that's today. Unfinished stories, the brains that can't leave them alone, the bodies that pay for it, either way, and proof from where we're standing that it's possible to come out the other side of it intact. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this: you don't get to control the story someone else tells about you. You never did. But you get to control whether you become a person who does the same thing to someone else. That's the only closure that was ever actually available to any of us, and it turns out it's enough. Okay. I'm Beth, spin-off script, Unbound. If you want to reach out or anything, want to help support the production costs of the show, want to join the Facebook group, all the information is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Unbound Off Script. Someone eventually had to pull the plug because, as you know, Beth will happily keep talking until the sun goes down. Thanks for listening, and we will see you whenever she finally runs out of things to say. I'm Rob, she's a blabbermouth, and we're out.